Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of those of you who are joining us from Europe and the United States. Chiarete and venido bueno. My name is Sharon Gerstel, and I'm director of the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture. I would like to welcome you to the third live event in 10 days of films, lectures, and book discussions that are the fruit of a productive collaboration between our center, the Consulate General of Greece in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles Greek Film Festival. In order to register for these events, please visit the website of the UCLA SNF Hellenic Center or that of Los Angeles Greek Film Festival. This event is being held under the auspices of the Greek Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in partnership with the Pan-Epiretic Federation of America and the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies. I gratefully acknowledge Aliki Parotti and Seth Frank, who have generously provided financial support for the entire event, enabling all lectures and films, including The Great Fire of Salonika, Birth of a City, Heroes of Salonika, and the North American premiere of My People, the Jews of Greece, to be offered free of cost across the globe. After the lecture, I will open the screen to questions, which you can either type into the chat or raise your hand virtually and be recognized. For the moment, and out of courtesy to the speaker and to your fellow listeners, please be sure that your microphone is on mute. Before introducing today's special speaker, I would like to warmly welcome my friend, the Consul General of Greece in Los Angeles, Mrs. Evgenia Baniatoglou, to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Sharon. Dear guests, thank you all so much for your continued support throughout all these days. We have had thousands who have watched the films and participated in discussions and lectures, and we are all very grateful to you. Let me thank my very good friend, Sharon Gerstel, the director of the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of the Hellenic Culture, Mr. Aris Katopodis, the director of the LAGFF, and my colleagues at the Public Diplomacy Office, Andrea Spirou and Christina Baruti, for their very hard work for many, many weeks now in order to make this event a reality. I also wish to thank the Pan-Epiretic Federation of America and its president, Mr. John Katsibaris, for co-sponsoring the event. I am very, very honored and touched to have Leon Saltiel as today's speaker. Leon is a very close friend of mine, and our friendship goes back many years. Leon has been constantly fighting and working on making known to the wider public the story of the Greek Jews of Thessaloniki and how they perished in the Holocaust. All of us need to be fully aware of what happened not so many decades ago and acknowledge our mistakes so that such atrocities never happen again. I sincerely hope that when the situation permits, we will be able to host Leon Saltiel in Los Angeles and hear what he has to say in person. Leon, thank you very much for being here today with us, and I look forward to hearing your lecture. Thank you.
It is an honor today for me to introduce formally Dr. Leon Saltiel, who is both a political scientist and a well-known historian. Since 2018, Dr. Saltiel has served as a member of the Greek government delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. His presence with us today reminds us about one of the purposes of our 10-day event, which, while remembering, also looks to the future as Greece assumes the presidency on March 1st of IRA. Like Professor Rika Benvenista, whom we were fortunate to hear on Saturday, and Dr. Rena Mochos, who will speak on Wednesday, Dr. Saltiel's work investigates the life of the Jewish community of Thessaloniki, the largest community of Jews in Greece before the Holocaust. A trained historian, he analyzes documents, including items of personal correspondence, but he also considers spaces. And no one can walk through Thessaloniki, even today, without being aware of those spaces, empty, haunted, and meaningful. Saltiel's work looks at issues of presence and erasure, relationships and fracture, loss and guilt. He is the author of a number of important studies: The Holocaust in Thessaloniki, Reactions to the Anti-Jewish Persecution, 1942 to 1943, published in 2020. Do Not Forget Me, Three Jewish Mothers Write to Their Sons from Thessaloniki, edited in 2018. And Anti-Semitism in Greece Today, Manifestations, Causes, and Addressing the Issue, co-authored in 2017. He has also published a number of significant articles, among them Resistance or Collaboration, The Greek Christian Elites of Thessaloniki Facing the Holocaust, Efforts to Save Jewish Children During the Occupation, An Unknown Scheme of Illegal Adoptions, and The Destruction of Thessaloniki's Jewish Cemetery. It is this last article which is the subject of today's lecture. No faculty member or student at Aristotle University, where Saltiel worked and where Consul General Beniatoglu and I both studied, could have been unaware that buildings intended for learning were founded on the ruins of the destroyed Jewish cemetery, a cemetery that once contained nearly 500,000 graves. It is this cemetery that concerns us today, its significance, its expropriation, and its use as a quarry of stones carved with the names of deceased Jews. Why was this space so important, and who made the decision to expropriate it? And how can we remember a place whose principal function was to preserve memory? Let us welcome Dr. Leon Saltiel, who will speak to us today on the topic, Dehumanizing the Dead, the Destruction of Thessaloniki's Jewish Cemetery during World War II. Dr. Saltiel.
Thank you so much. And before I begin, I would like to thank the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture and its director, Professor Sharon Gerstel, the Los Angeles Greek Film Festival, the Consulate General of Greece in Los Angeles, and of course, my dear friend, the Consul General, Evgenia Beniatoglu, for this very kind introduction. As this conference is virtual, I've added a lot of photos in my presentation to make it more interactive. I would also like to apologize in advance. As I'll be discussing the destruction of a cemetery, some of the things I'll say and show are sad and a bit macabre. Lastly, I'll focus my presentation on the destruction of the cemetery. I will not discuss the deportation of the Jews of Thessaloniki or other aspects of the Holocaust due to time constraints, but we can discuss some of these related topics during the Q&A. So allow me to share my PowerPoint. And I will briefly discuss an overview of the presence, the Jewish presence in Thessaloniki, the story of the cemetery before the war, the beginning of the German occupation of Thessaloniki and these anti-Jewish measures, the destruction of the Jewish cemetery, the tombstones that you can find today in Thessaloniki, and also the creation of the monument and how the city is reconciling itself with its past. For more than 20 centuries, Thessaloniki has been home to a vibrant Jewish community. The first Jews may have arrived from Alexandria around 140 BCE. The ancient Jewish community of Thessaloniki constituted a typical example of a Judaic community in the Mediterranean urban center of the Hellenistic and Roman eras. It's in this city synagogue that Apostle Paul came to preach the new religion. Following the Spanish Inquisition in 1492, thousands of fleeing Jews found shelter in Thessaloniki, creating a large and flourishing Jewish community, one of the most prominent in the world. These Jews were called Sephardim and kept the Old Castilian idiom to our days, known as Ladino or Judo-Spanish. When the Greek army entered the city in 1912, the Jewish community constituted the majority of the inhabitants, some 80,000 people out of a population of 150,000. During the Second World War, more than 90% of the city's 50,000 Jews were transported and murdered in the Auschwitz death camp. In the chronology after the 1912 Balkan Wars, where the city joined the rest of Greece, We had the Great Fire of 1917, which devastated most of the historic center. And I encourage you to watch a film on the same topic that's part of this festival. 1922, of course, there's the Greek-Turkish War with the 1923 Lausanne Treaty, where we have a big exchange of populations between Christians and Muslims. And this is also changing the city of the character of the city. And as I said, in 1912, approximately 50% of the population of Thessaloniki were Jews. In 1943, on the eve of the deportations, we speak around 20%. And this is a little bit of a graph from the 15th century until the 1950s of how the population developed in the city based on ethnic and religious lines. In December 1942, 3 months before the deportations of the Jews of Thessaloniki began, a rare event in the history of Nazi-occupied Europe took place: the destruction of the vast and ancient Jewish cemetery of Thessaloniki. The Nazis lacked a consistent policy regarding Jewish cemeteries. As Carla Hess and Thomas Laqueur point out, quote, "In general, the Nazis did not systematically direct their fury against bones and monuments. All of Europe's major Jewish cemeteries, except that of Thessaloniki, survived the Holocaust more or less intact. This includes those in the very heart of National Socialism," end quote. The same can be said for most other Jewish cemeteries in Greece that survived the war. The old Jewish cemetery of Thessaloniki was probably the largest Jewish necropolis in Europe, numbering nearly 500,000 graves and covering an area of 350,000 square meters, or 86 acres, a powerful symbol of the centuries-old Jewish presence in the city. Initially outside the city walls, the cemetery became a central location as the city expanded eastwards. Its vast area gradually inhibited local transportation, and residents would complain that it attracted illegal and immoral activities in the late hours. And this new reality put the position of the cemetery in jeopardy. As Maria Vasilikou wrote, quote, "The Jewish cemetery had been threatened long before the murderous policies of the Nazi troops reached Salonika Jews and their cultural heritage," end quote. Following the Great Fire of 1917, the city was almost completely destroyed. French urban planner Ernest Ebrard prepared the first plan for the rebuilding of the burnt area, which was approved in March 1919. Ebrard used the latest practices in urban planning, which dictated that cemeteries should be removed from within the city limits. He envisioned the area as the main campus of the University of Thessaloniki and a large park, removing thus the cemetery from the city's blueprint. This issue became a cause of friction between the Greek authorities and the 50,000-strong Jewish community in a city of 250,000 residents. But using religious, historical, and political arguments, the latter managed to delay this discussion. In 1937, a law gave part of the cemetery land to the university, while the rest of the area would be turned into a park, where the existing tombs would remain untouched. Burials in the old cemetery would be prohibited after 1 year. Although a part was indeed given to the university, burials on the remaining land continued, and a park was never created. So here I'm showing you different photos of the cemetery before the war, where you can see its vast size. Here are some historical maps where you see the old city of Thessaloniki, and in its east, you see it says Jewish cemeteries in French. Another map here also indicating cemeteries east of the city. Again here, and you can see the vast size of the cemeteries. This is a modern map of Thessaloniki, where I've more or less showed where is the old city walls, and you can see today where is the university located is the areas of the old Jewish cemetery. Again, that's one of the first buildings of the university. In the background, you can see a view of the cemeteries. Again, before the destruction. So now I will be starting a little bit to discuss the German occupation. As you know, after the Greek-Italian War, that Greece was victorious against the Italian army. The Germans invaded to help their Italian allies, and Greece fell under the Axis control. Most of the city, as you can see, most of the country was under Italian control, with the parts in the East Macedonian Thrace in green, annexed by Bulgaria, and the Germans keeping what they thought were the more strategic areas, that is the city of Thessaloniki with environs, some islands, part of Crete, and the strip of land bordering Turkey, and of course the port of Piraeus. So somehow geography was fatal for the Jews of Thessaloniki, as they fell under German control from right at the beginning. A little bit for you to know the timeline of the events that I will be discussing. The German army enters Thessaloniki in April 1941. They leave eventually in the 30th of October 1944. 11th of July 1942, we have the Liberty Square events that I'll be shortly talking about. A few months after, it's the destruction of the Jewish cemetery. 1943, we start the anti-Jewish measures with the Yellow Star and the ghettoization of the population. And the deportations commence on the 15th of March. So the first mass anti-Semitic measure after the German army occupied Thessaloniki in April 1941 was the compulsory assembly in Liberty Square of all Jewish males on Saturday, July 11th, 1942, to be mobilized for forced labor. The Black Sabbath, as it became known, so approximately 8,500 Jews, men aged 18 to 45, going through humiliating gymnastic exercises under a blistering sun. German soldiers beat those unlucky Jews who arrived late, smoked, or dared to sit down. The purpose for forcibly drafting such a labor force was mainly for construction work, and this gathering seems to be a local initiative without explicit orders from Berlin. In the following weeks, until the end of August 1942, some 3,500 Jewish men were drafted and sent to different parts of Greece to build roads, railways, and airports, and work in mines. Most of these men had never been employed in heavy construction, and they were far from qualified. Under a harsh regime of hard labor and limited food and hygiene, many suffered. When the first bodies were returned to Thessaloniki, it caused an outrage in the Jewish community. The population demanded that its leadership improve the working and living conditions of the laborers. As winter was approaching, efforts were made to negotiate the release of the laborers by paying a ransom. The Jewish community had agreed to the amount of 2 billion drachmas, a very important sum at the time. However, the German officer in charge of civilian affairs, Max Merten, approved the 2 billion in cash deal, but added a new stipulation: the destruction of the old Jewish cemetery of Thessaloniki, the land of which he valued at 1.5 billion drachmas. Merten, from his dealings with Greek officials, must have quickly realized that the cemetery was a wedge issue between the Greek authorities and the Jewish community. Merten tried to please his interlocutors with an issue that meant little to him and much to them. And here you see one of these checks that have been found of the ransom that were paid by the Jewish community to the German authorities. And you can see behind the check that has been endorsed by the signature of Max Merten. Merten's new demand caught the community leaders off guard and left them with little room to maneuver. The demand for the cemetery, in addition to the ransom for the release of the Jewish laborers, further complicated the discussion. Merten must have been informed that in Jewish tradition, a cemetery can never be removed. Nevertheless, he showed no signs of compromise, and the Jewish leaders were left with no choice but to succumb to the German blackmail. All documentation clearly shows that the German officers were directing the whole project. However, the Greek authorities proposed no modifications and were tasked with the implementation of the decisions. Only Jewish community officials offered some last unsuccessful efforts to change the plans. Despite the ongoing but slow negotiations, eventually the destruction process of the vast Jewish necropolis did begin on December 6, 1942, marked by a meeting of Merten with Greek and Jewish community officials on the cemetery grounds. 500 workers were reportedly tasked by the municipality, with the city spending around 100 million drachmas for the destruction of the graves and the gathering of the materials in piles. Jewish eyewitnesses noted the remarkable speed and zeal with which the workers took to their task. Yom Tov Yakoel, the Jewish community's legal advisor, wrote, quote, "It's obvious from such a hasty manner and the excessive enthusiasm shown by the Greek authorities that it was not just the springs or the beautification of the city that motivated the authorities to quickly demolish the Jewish monuments." In just a couple of weeks, wrote the Thessaloniki Rabbi Michael Molcho, quote, "The vast necropolis, skirted with fragments of stone and rubble, resembled a city that had been bombed or destroyed by a volcanic eruption," end quote. Local Jews raced to save the remains of their loved ones as the workers were destroying the cemetery. Based on interviews with Jewish refugees who arrived in Istanbul, US Consul Burton Berry reported back to Washington, quote, "Workers set out dismantling the tombs and disinterring the dead. The work of destroying the cemetery was done in such haste that very few Jews succeeded in finding the remains of their families and relatives. Recently buried dead were thrown to the dogs." And here you see some pictures of the destruction of the cemetery. And it's interesting that you see some tombs are still intact in the first years after the end of the war. A few weeks after the destruction of the cemetery, the Jews of Thessaloniki were forced into ghettos, and from there they were transported to the Nazi death camp in Auschwitz, in German-occupied Poland. The cemetery grounds became in effect a huge quarry. The Germans, the church, the city, associations, theaters, and many others used the marble stones and the bricks as construction materials. And modern visitor to Thessaloniki can still see stones with Hebrew inscriptions in parks and churchyards. Molcho describes what happened to the materials, quote, "The memorial stones remain piled up, mixed up in the old necropolis. They are the disposal of the first passerby. The marble merchants enrich their stock, delete the inscriptions, and use the marble in various ways. Churches pave their courtyards with them. They are used to adorn and to repair the nearby houses. Some schools lay their courtyards without even caring to erase the visible signs that betray their origin. The Nazis take them to construct a swimming pool. The whole city is full of them, and the price of marble falls in the market. After the war, the plunder continues, and the venerable cemetery is transformed into a big marble quarry from where all the buildings are supplied," end quote. And here you see some of these photos of the pool that were constructed using the tombstones, inspected by officers of the British Army after the war. This is again British officers inspecting tombstones that are used in military works. And these are the merchants who take the stones so that they can be used as building materials for other construction. You see the yard that Rabbi Molcho was talking about. And these are stones being sold right in front of the White Tower, who most of you may know, which is the symbol of Thessaloniki. The municipality of Thessaloniki requested 100,000 bricks from the demolished Jewish cemetery. It did so before the supply is exhausted, so they can be collected for needs that might arise. The Ioannidis school received 5,000 bricks and 100 square meters of marble, destined for the construction of toilets for the use of the children using the soup kitchen. The sailing club wrote to the city council, informing them that in February 42, they had created the soup kitchen to feed 250 poor children, and it needed a pavilion for the food distribution outdoors. For the said pavilion, they had already received 30,000 bricks from the Jewish cemetery. However, they still needed wood and tiles, which they requested the municipal council approved. When the State Theatre of Thessaloniki was established in August 1943, the director of the theater addressed the German administration, which laid the entrance with marble originating from the Jewish cemetery. The nearby Christian cemetery of Agia Fotini also used materials from the destroyed Jewish cemetery. Its small temple received marbles for its interior elements, the iconostasis, the floor, and the wall claddings. Later, it received marble, stones, and bricks for the construction of a fence, buildings, courtyards, etc. Similar requests also came from churches. Vasilis Rizaleos counted 17 such requests out of 70 churches in Thessaloniki from January 16, 1943, 2 months before the start of the deportations, to October 18, 1943. The reasons offered vary from the need to expand the church to future paving. Some of the churches also requested funds to transport the materials. The newly established Medical School of Thessaloniki also benefited from the destroyed Jewish cemetery. Tombstones were used as dissecting tables for the anatomy course. They also constructed 3 big pits with thick cement where they would bring and place bodies from the destroyed cemetery in order for them to be used for the training of the students. Many actors were involved in the plunder of the cemetery: the state, the municipality, the church, local associations, and businessmen, with complex relations, competing roles, and not aided by the lack of a clear hierarchy. The Germans kept overall control, while several Greek government agencies were involved with the practical arrangements. Due to its vast size and number of graves, as well as limited means at the time, the destruction of the cemetery was not completed during the war, and it continued after liberation. In fact, most of the heavy digging took place after the war, as the new university buildings were being constructed. The land dug from the old cemetery area was used for the enlargement of the seafront of Thessaloniki. The Jewish community complained, to no avail, arguing that the land contained the physical remains of the Jews of Thessaloniki buried in this area. A central street in Thessaloniki was paved with Jewish tombstones. At the same time, individuals would continue to grab tombstones to be used as building materials. The Jewish community, as well as foreign Jewish organizations, made requests on this topic to the Greek authorities with limited success. The bones of a Jewish grave that were discovered during excavation works in 1963 were thrown by the workers in a nearby ditch. Here you see pictures, and as you can see, the construction has already started after the war on the grounds of the old cemetery. This is the seafront that I was speaking about, that many of you must have walked by, and you have seen the extension, and many of this rubble contains stones and bones from the cemetery as the buildings of the university were excavated and the rubble was thrown to enlarge the seafront. Here is a little bit how the seafront was and how after the works it's a straight line. Nowhere did we see any moral considerations around this issue. In July 1946, a Jewish delegation in Thessaloniki, which included Dr. Cecil Roth, reader of Jewish studies at Oxford University, saw carts in the cemetery removing Hebrew tombstones on the instructions of the director of antiquities for the province, and visited the church of St. Demetrius to witness the reparation works with the use of the said tombstones. The St. Demetrius Basilica is built on the grave of the patron saint of Thessaloniki, and it was mostly destroyed during the Great Fire in 1917. The Jewish delegation contacted Stylianos Pelekanidis, the curator of Byzantine antiquities for northern Greece, and the main person responsible for the church's restoration. He only saw the holy and positive sides of his actions. The utilization of the marble for such a holy piece of work as the reconstruction of the St. Demetrius Church, he claimed, was even a positive action when considering that stones of the Jewish cemetery had been used for all sorts of purposes, even for pavements and toilets. He also blamed the Jews for not indicating to his service the tombstones of historical value prior to the deportations, and offered additional legalistic excuses, arguing that the Jewish community had no property deeds. Here you see pictures from the St. Demetrius Church. Here are some pictures of students who visit the grounds of the old cemetery as part of school excursions, and they take pictures with skulls and bones of dead Jews that they found on the grounds. Here's also another group of students visiting as part of a school excursion the grounds of the old cemetery as part of a day out from school. Yacoel, the Jewish community's legal advisor, writes that, quote, the satisfaction of a years-long demand of Christian public opinion led the Germans to get involved in this non-military, purely political issue. Indeed, the rapidity and purposefulness with which the vast Jewish cemetery was destroyed, the fact that its bones were left in the ground, and that all traces of its existence are lost to contemporary memory, as well as the fate of the tombstones, all point to that direction. Senior Greek leaders at the time of the German occupation openly stated their wish, the wish of the people, that was to move the cemetery to another location. General Chrysochou, a very influential Greek officer at the time, testifying as a defense witness at Max Mertens' trial in 1959, said, quote, it was the general request from the Christians of Thessaloniki for the cemetery to leave the city center and to be moved away because it was now next to houses, end quote. General Governor of Macedonia, Vassilios Simonidis, described the destruction of the cemetery as a big beautifying project, which will have a beneficial influence on the development by and large of the city, end quote. An argument that was interestingly repeated after the war by the Thessaloniki city authorities. The presence of the Germans altered the established modus vivendi with regards to the cemetery. The Jewish community, which had managed to resist efforts up until then, lost the domestic and international leverage it once enjoyed. Merton had told the Jewish community elders, quote, many here are your enemies, and they repeatedly lobbied the German military administration for the destruction of the cemeteries and for the implementation of anti-Semitic measures, end quote. Claire Zaltz and Al Brutman provide the following analysis on the role of the Thessaloniki authorities with regards to the destruction of the cemetery. Quote, local authorities used the German presence to implement their project. One could thus speak of the opportunity effect of anti-Semitic policy, which made it possible to disregard the protest of the Jewish community of Thessaloniki in order to raise and obliterate their graves, end quote. General Chrysochou went further and testified during Merton's trial that the destruction of the cemetery was celebrated as a huge benefit, causing the reporting journalists to add that this phrase stirred emotions among the audience. Yacoel provided similar information. Quote, besides, it became known that Christian representatives visited the German military commander to thank him on behalf of the city's Greek population for the definitive solution of this issue, end quote. Furthermore, in reply to the presiding judge's question, could you now tell us who dug up and sold its marbles? Chrysochou stated, it was said that what we wanted to do, we did it through Merton. The destruction of the Jewish necropolis of Thessaloniki was not just an event in a linear sequence of Nazi anti-Semitic measures in the city. It was not directly linked to the so-called final solution, and it coincided with the deportations of the Jews that were put in motion a few weeks later. During this time, the main initiators were the resident German officers, with the contribution of local Greek Christians against the local Jews without any instructions or involvement from Berlin. The destruction of the cemetery tested the relations between the German military authorities, the Greek authorities, and the Jewish community on the eve of the deportations. Hess and Lacour concluded, quote, the story of the destruction of the Jewish cemetery from the landscape of modern Thessaloniki lies in the temporal convergence of three narratives, that of the Holocaust, that of modernization and a shift in the place of the dead away from the living, and finally that of Greek national integration. Nowhere else, in no other great city, did the imperatives of modernity and nation building telescope so decisively with the crisis of occupation and genocide, end quote. The presence of the Germans accelerated developments had been in motion for decades, but hidden just below the surface. They were the enablers, the catalysts. It's clear that they were responding to a local demand, willing to accommodate certain wishes of the local Greek Christian population and its leaders, and they took it upon themselves to oversee the cemetery destruction project. They had the main role in all of the events, issuing the orders, chairing the meetings, and even regulating the allocation of tombstones. During this time, there were no official reactions from the Greek authorities or the Christian population either for the Liberty Square events, the forced labor, or the destruction of the cemetery. In a certain way, the extensive use of the tombstones of the destroyed cemetery by all sectors of Thessaloniki society, including the church, gave this action a sense of legality and invited every ordinary citizen to participate. It legitimized the anti-Jewish actions and solidified the clientele relations between the Germans and the Greek authorities. Yale professor Timothy Snyder observed that, quote, such a major property transfer of the land of the cemetery generated a sense of material complicity between Germans and locals, as well as a new moral barrier between non-Jewish Greeks and Greek Jews, end quote. The whole operation was also full of symbolism, that the sign of Thessaloniki's future, the university that would educate the future generation of Greeks, would be built on the land which hosted the generations-old remains and historical monuments of the other. 2 months before Eichmann's men, Dieter Wisliceni and Alois Brunner, arrived in Thessaloniki to execute the so-called final solution, the city's Jews saw the historic cemetery destroyed by an alignment of interest and ideology and disoriented moral compass. The Jews lost their connections to the roots as they themselves were about to be uprooted. They were met with neglect, indifference, and worse, hostility by the authorities, the same people who should have protected them during those difficult times. Only in November 2014 did the university build a monument on its grounds to commemorate the existence of the old cemetery. Earlier, in 2011, the Greek state had reimbursed the Jewish community for the land of the cemetery that was taken away. So here I have a section where you can see tombstones in Thessaloniki as they can be found today. These are some of the leftovers outside of the St. Dimitri's church. This is inside the church. Other churches that have used tombstones. This is the Hagia Sophia church. This is in some pavement close to the new railway station, in the park, in the Central Park in Thessaloniki. These are the marbles in front of the theater that I talked about that were used by tombstones. In the park in front of the White Tower, there is a fragment as well. These are Jewish tombstones used by the Nazis as graves for their own troops. This is the land of the university today, which is of course the area that we're talking about. And here in the new grounds in the university, you can still find tombstones full of graffiti. This is stones from a summer house, some 150 kilometers away, where the people thought it would be very interesting to decorate their houses with tombstones. This is in Panorama, an institute that had a lot of tombstones, and after the community was alerted, they were removed and gathered. This is a house in Panorama today that its fence is made by tombstones. You can still see today. And this is the monument I talked about in November 2014. And you can see Mayor Yannis Boutaris at the time at the inauguration. This is the simple monument on its grounds. Unfortunately, it has been vandalized a few times, most recently in January 2019, which was completely unearthed. And just to show you how the city is changing, in an exhibition organized by the Archaeological Service of Thessaloniki and the Ministry of Culture for the 100 years of the Great Fire in December 2017, the use of tombstones by the St. Dimitri's Church is described as a stain. So you can see how local narratives are changing in the city and people are perceiving what happened, what I described to you as highly problematic. And this also helps the city reconcile itself with its history. So thank you so much for your attention. Allow me some self-promotion of my publications where you can find more information about everything I've said. And now I'm happy to give the floor back to Professor Kerstel. Thank you so much.
But I also want to thank you for your service to IRA and how important that is for all of us that this organization continue and flourish. And I look forward to seeing what moves will be made by the new Greek president of the organization. And I hope people will be able to write to you directly. Sandra, for example, making this film, and maybe see if somehow these new endeavors can be incorporated into the work of Ira so that we can really showcase the story of Greek Jewry in a really full way. So thank you so much. If people have kind of a way to clap, I would say everybody raise your hands and celebrate what has been an exceptional lecture. Len, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the 150 people that spent a couple of hours with us this evening, this morning, this afternoon, whatever it is in different time zones. Thank you to Evgenia for speaking, for you, Sharon, Ellen for organizing everything, Devin for intervening, and thank you all for listening and contributing. And of course, I'm open. Find me on social media, and I'll be happy to help you if I can help with your projects.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to reconvening with everyone on Wednesday to hear Rana Mojo lecture about exactly this issue of why it took Greece so long to acknowledge this situation, this tragic situation. And in the meantime, to remind you that if you go onto the Los Angeles Greek Film Festival webpage, you will find the links to 12 films about the story of Jewish Greek, both Romaniotis and Sephardites. So please, the films are all free, and except for Romaniotis, they are worldwide distribution. So learn, participate with us, and we'll see you on Wednesday.